Hello, EN112 students. These slides and my talk are designed to help you better understand your explanation, essay, and causal relationships. And I am relying on chapter 9 in your course book. I use some of their examples, but I also use some supplementary material. So let's look at the first issue of why do we even discuss causal relationships, or why are we writing explanation essays? And the answer is very simple, because in almost any class that you will have to write a research paper, you are likely to encounter questions that will ask you to provide a causal analysis or an explanation. And here is a set of examples. Now, if we look at this picture, I think it's easy to state that if the character pushes the first domino, the line of dominoes will fall, and that push causes the dominoes to fall. So that's a simple causal relationship. However, if we are trying to explain why this child is having a temper tantrum in a grocery store, the explanation might be more complicated. Strictly speaking, bear that in mind, that when scientists do talk about causal relationships, then this is what they mean. Every time A happens, B also happens. So then A causes B. Temperature drops, water freezes, somebody pushes a domino, the line falls down. It does not matter who creates the effect. Anybody can push the dominoes, they will always fall, or anywhere you put the water below 0 Celsius temperature, it will freeze. The causal relationship can be repeated and duplicated in experiments, always with the same result. Now, let's look at another relationship, which is called correlation. And those of you who have taken social science classes or psychology, they already learned the mantra that correlation is not, strictly speaking, causation. In other words, if there is correlation, we still have to explain how the correlation is a causal relationship. So here is a scatter plot to show you this, which shows the relationship between time spent running and body fat. And you can see on this coordinate that the more time someone spends running, the less body fat is measured. So this is kind of a negative correlation, because you can draw a straight line here that is downward sloping. However, you can also see that it's not 100% causal relationship, because you can see some dots where some people don't spend too much time running, but their body fat is still low. And you can also see some people who spend significantly more time running, but their body fat is still relatively high. So, statistical correlation is used as evidence for possible cause-effect relationship in human behavior and social trends. Effectiveness of medication, for example, or the effectiveness of education can also only be based on high correlation, but it is never 100%. Cause-effect relationships in the truest sense are supposed to mean 100% correlation, but that is very, very rare. Mostly it occurs in the physical world. And then another problem with correlations is that sometimes there's a very high correlation between two entities, such as the diagnosis of autism and organic food sales. But then this is called spurious correlation, because even though the correlation is statistically high, but there is no rhyme or reason there, or we have no reason to believe that there is any kind of relationship between these two factors, or that one of them explains the other. Coincidence is when, again, two things happen at the same time or seem to be related, but again, there is no reason to believe that they are. Here is one example. All women's problems begin with men. Well, it might be funny, but this is not really a fully established fact. And there is another coincidence. Two persons have the same name and they even look the same and they ended up in the same prison, but they are not related and they are two different persons. And this happened in 1903, after which in law enforcement they started using fingerprints for identification because it was determined that names and photographs are not reliable enough. Now, we also had another explanation situation, or when we read Lori Alward's chapter about the Navajo plague, and then we could see the effects, the symptoms: headaches, cough, runny nose, difficulty breathing, hypoxia, no oxygen in the blood, lungs filled with fluid, and eventually some of these patients unfortunately died, and some ended up with acute respiratory illness. And at first there was no explanation, so they tried to figure out if this problem is caused by the surgery, the Navajo lifestyle, or the tourists bringing the disease, or there were some odd explanations about radioactivity, and even traditional Navajo wisdom was investigated, and they asked the Hatali, a Navajo medicine man, to find out what he thought, and he came up with an explanation that was partially confirmed by the Centers for Disease Control, who identified in the lab the hantavirus, which can be inhaled from deer mice droppings, and that caused the disease. Because causes and effects and explanations are so complicated and complex sometimes, your course book lists different types of causes. Some of them are necessary causes. You have to have chlorophyll in order for photosynthesis to happen. And terrorism is defined as random killings or intentional killings, but it has to be committed by persons who are either religious or political fanatics or share some fanatic views or extreme views. Sufficient causes are, this term is often used in legal and law enforcement context. Drinking alcohol while driving is a sufficient cause for someone's arrest. You don't have to have evidence that your driving is impaired or that you are intoxicated. Precipitating causes are when one seemingly small event leads to a much bigger one, just like Rosa Parks in 1955 refusing to give up her seat on a bus led to the civil rights movement. Proximate causes are the causes that meet the eyes, and first we think a student fails the class because a student plagiarized, but if we look at remote or deeper causes, then we might find many different reasons why that happened. Reciprocal causes are causes that kind of go back and forth. Stressed people tend to be obese partially because of stress eating, but obesity also causes stress, and obese people get more stressed, and then there is this vicious cycle. Some issues are too complex to have one explanation or one cause, and that's when it's useful to talk about contributing factors. Like if somebody had to write a paper about what causes school violence, then you might want to mention several factors: guns, family dysfunction, video games, bullying, and many more. So here is some advice from your chapter that is very helpful. Don't jump to conclusions. Appreciate your limits. Some problems are naturally complex, so don't be afraid not to be able to answer every question. And always provide sufficient evidence for your claims. So if you think that, say, family dysfunction causes bullying, then provide some evidence, statistics, testimonials, or whatever you find in your research. Use qualifiers in your claims. Use words like some, many, often, or frequently instead of making global claims. And try to avoid faulty analysis or explanations, or if you find something that does not make much sense or is not plausible, then signal that some people think that this is the cause, but it's not very likely. And always consider other reasons or explanations than what you found. So keep asking questions like, what if there are other reasons? So if you examine what causes success for head start programs or violence in movies, does it really cause violence? Is it true that all horror movie lovers get violent? Or guns, are all gun owners violent? Sometimes separating causes and effects is difficult, so I would recommend that if you run into that problem, you write 2 separate paragraphs. For example, lack of physical exercise might be one of the causes of obesity, but it can also be the effect. Yes, because obese people or children too, they say that they do not exercise because they are too fat and cannot move without inconvenience, or they are afraid of being ridiculed. And finally, here is the structure for this essay. And just like chapter 9 says, do not be frugal with your introduction. Spend time, write a paragraph persuading your reader that your topic matters and that it's important and they should think about it. Your thesis should be an explanation thesis. So here is one example. Explanations for anorexia need to include contributing factors that do not blame society or family only. That's a thesis without points. And there's another one. Anorexia has biological, psychological, environmental, and genetic causes, and each case represents a unique combination of these factors. Now that's a mouthful, but if you run into a thesis statement that is this long, you can break it down into 2 sentences. Again, background information, history, definitions, those are important paragraphs, so if you haven't planned for them yet, please do. In this case, it would be important to explain what anorexia is, what is the medical or psychological definition, and a brief history perhaps. Since when are we talking about anorexia? Has it been always around, or is this something that maybe in the past 100 and 200 years has been paid attention to? And then your paragraphs, explanation 1 with supporting details, explanation 2, 3, 4, depending on your topic. And you should also signal which one is more probable or plausible, and you might want to include one that is really kind of odd, but you came across it in your research anyway. And then finally, the conclusion. And I think that should be enough to help you, and I'm really looking forward to reading your first drafts this week. Take care and keep up the good work.